They could hear the German voices in the darkness, calling out to each other as they moved through the Belgian forest. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chappuis stood in the frozen command post at Foy, 3 miles north of Bastogne, and counted the reports coming in from his perimeter outposts: German infantry to the north, German armour to the east, more Germans moving west along the road from Bussy. The 2nd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was being surrounded. It was December 20th, 1944. Chappuis had approximately 200 paratroopers under his command in this sector, holding a defensive arc that stretched nearly 2 miles across rolling Belgian farmland. His intelligence officer estimated they were facing elements of at least 2 German regiments, perhaps 2,500 men, with armour support. The Germans were moving methodically, closing the circle, cutting off escape routes back to Bastogne. Any conventional infantry unit would have begun planning a withdrawal. The tactical manuals were clear about avoiding encirclement. Being surrounded meant being cut off from supply, from reinforcement, from artillery support. It meant fighting in every direction simultaneously while your ammunition dwindled and your casualties mounted. It meant, statistically, either death or capture. Chappuis gave the order to dig in deeper. His men would hold their positions. They would let the Germans surround them completely, and then they would destroy every German unit that tried to break through their perimeter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This decision, which would have seemed suicidal to any other infantry formation in the American or German army, made perfect tactical sense to American paratroopers in December 1944. The reason why requires understanding not just what happened at Bastogne, but what the United States Army Airborne had become by the winter of 1944 through 5, and what made these soldiers fundamentally different from every other infantry unit in the European theatre. The paratroopers at Foy were not surrounded by accident or by German tactical brilliance. They had been trained, equipped, and psychologically conditioned for exactly this situation. Being surrounded was not a disaster to be avoided. It was a tactical condition they had prepared for since their first week of jump training. The perimeter defense, the all-around security, the expectation of fighting isolated and outnumbered, these were the core principles of airborne doctrine. What the Germans moving through the forest that December night did not understand, what they could not have understood without experiencing American airborne training themselves, was that they were not trapping 200 paratroopers in a pocket. They were putting themselves inside a killing zone that had been designed, rehearsed, and perfected specifically to destroy attacking forces through controlled defensive fire. Over the next 6 hours, the German units assaulting the Foy perimeter would suffer approximately 800 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The paratroopers would hold every inch of their defensive line, and the reason this was possible, the reason 200 men could inflict such devastating losses on a force 10 times their size, lies in understanding what American airborne forces had become by late 1944, how they were trained, what equipment they carried, and most importantly, what they believed about themselves and their capabilities. The United States Army Airborne did not exist before 1940. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the American military had no parachute infantry, no airborne doctrine, no transport aircraft dedicated to dropping troops behind enemy lines, concept of vertical envelopment, delivering combat troops by parachute to seize objectives deep in enemy territory, was a German innovation that shocked the world during the invasions of Holland and Belgium in May 1940. German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, had captured the Belgian fort Eben-Emael in a matter of hours, using glider-borne assault troops. They had seized critical bridges in Holland before ground forces could destroy them. The speed and audacity of these operations convinced American military planners that airborne forces represented the future of mobile warfare. If the United States was going to fight in Europe, it would need its own paratroopers. The Army established the Parachute Test Platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia, in June 1940. 48 volunteers underwent experimental training to determine if parachute infantry was even feasible. The results were promising enough that the Army authorized formation of the 1st Parachute Infantry Battalion in September 1940. By December 1941, when the United States entered the war, the Army had 4 parachute infantry regiments in training. The training these men underwent was unlike anything else in the American military. It had to be. Paratroopers would be dropped behind enemy lines, often miles from friendly forces, with only the equipment they could carry and the ammunition they jumped with. They would have no armor support, no artillery beyond what they brought with them, and no guarantee of resupply or reinforcement. They would be surrounded from the moment they landed until ground forces linked up with them, if ground forces could link up with them. This reality shaped every aspect of airborne training. Physical conditioning was brutal. Men ran 5 miles before breakfast. They did hundreds of push-ups and pull-ups daily. They completed obstacle courses that left conventional infantry exhausted. The washout rate exceeded 50%. The Army wanted men who could march 25 miles carrying 80 pounds of equipment, then fight effectively at the end of that march. Weapons training emphasized individual marksmanship and small unit tactics. Every paratrooper qualified expert with the Monet-Garand rifle. They trained extensively with the Monet carbine, the weapon most paratroopers carried due to its lighter weight. They learned to operate Browning automatic rifles, 60mm mortars, and bazookas. Officers and NCOs trained with every weapon in the company, ensuring that if casualties eliminated the primary gunner, someone else could take over the weapon. Jump training came after basic infantry skills. At Fort Benning's parachute school, men learned to exit aircraft properly, control their descent, execute parachute landing falls that distributed impact forces across their bodies. They jumped from 34-foot towers to practice techniques. They jumped from 250-foot towers, suspended from static lines. Finally, they made 5 actual parachute jumps from C-47 aircraft, the last one a night jump, to simulate combat conditions. The jump wings they received after completing the 5th jump represented more than qualification in a new skill. They represented membership in an elite community. Paratroopers received $50 extra pay per month, jump pay, recognition that they were doing something more dangerous than regular infantry. More importantly, they received constant reinforcement that they were different, better, more capable than other soldiers. This psychological conditioning was deliberate. Airborne planners knew that paratroopers would face situations that would break conventional infantry units. Being surrounded, being outnumbered, fighting without support, these conditions would test men's courage and unit cohesion to the absolute limit. The answer was to create soldiers who believed they were superior to any enemy they would face, who welcomed difficult tactical situations as opportunities to prove their capabilities, who viewed being surrounded not as a crisis, but as a tactical condition they were specifically trained to exploit. By 1944, American airborne divisions had proven this training philosophy in combat. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped into Sicily in July 1943. The operations were chaotic, with paratroopers scattered across dozens of miles of Sicilian countryside, but small groups of men accomplished their objectives despite the dispersion. They seized bridges, blocked roads, created confusion far out of proportion to their actual numbers. In Normandy on June 6, 1944, both divisions jumped hours before the beach landings. Again, the drops were scattered. Paratroopers landed miles from their designated drop zones. Units were intermixed. Officers found themselves commanding men from different companies, different battalions. And yet, the paratroopers accomplished their primary mission. They seized the causeways behind Utah Beach. They captured Sainte-Mère-Église. They prevented German reinforcements from reaching the beaches during the critical first hours. The lesson the paratroopers drew from these experiences was that dispersion and isolation were not disasters. They were conditions under which airborne forces could still function effectively. A scattered drop meant you fought with whoever was near you, regardless of unit designation. Being cut off from higher headquarters meant junior officers and NCOs made tactical decisions on their own initiative. Being surrounded meant you established a perimeter and defended it until you could break out or until friendly forces reached you. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion. The unit, now digging in around Foy, had jumped into Normandy in darkness and fought for 33 days straight before being pulled back to England in July 1944. They jumped again in Operation Market Garden in September 1944, dropping into Holland to seize bridges over the Rhine. They fought for 72 days in Holland, often surrounded, always outnumbered, holding positions that conventional military doctrine said were indefensible. The men now at Foy were veterans. They had been surrounded before. They had fought surrounded before. And they had learned that being surrounded created tactical advantages if you understood how to exploit them. The key was firepower, specifically the concentration of automatic weapons fire that paratroopers could bring to bear on attacking forces. American airborne units in late 1944 carried more automatic weapons per man than any other infantry formation in any army. A standard rifle company in the regular infantry had one Browning automatic rifle per 12-man squad. A parachute rifle company had 2 BARs per squad. Regular infantry companies had 2 light machine guns per company. Parachute companies had 6. Regular infantry battalions had a heavy weapons company with 6 heavy machine guns. Parachute battalions had 8. This weapons density meant that an airborne platoon of 40 men could generate the same volume of sustained automatic fire as a regular infantry company of nearly 200 men. An airborne company could match the firepower of a regular infantry battalion, and when those weapons were positioned in carefully prepared defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, they created kill zones that attacking infantry could not cross without suffering catastrophic casualties. The ammunition load each paratrooper carried reflected this emphasis on sustained firepower. A regular infantryman carried 80 rounds for his Mon Garand, 8 clips of 8 rounds each. A paratrooper carried 120 rounds minimum, often more. BAR gunners carried 300 rounds. Machine gunners carried over 1,000 rounds, per gun, distributed among the gun crew. This ammunition was heavy. A basic load for a paratrooper weighed over 60 pounds before adding rations, water, grenades, anti-tank rockets, medical supplies, and specialized equipment. But the weight was acceptable because the firepower it represented was what kept paratroopers alive when they were surrounded and outnumbered. The tactical doctrine was simple. Establish a perimeter, position automatic weapons to cover all approaches, maintain ammunition discipline to ensure you didn't run dry, and destroy any enemy force that tried to penetrate your position through concentrated, controlled fire. The men of 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, who dug their foxholes in the frozen ground around Foy on December 20, 1944, were implementing a defensive system they had rehearsed dozens of times in training and executed successfully in combat. The system began with terrain analysis and position selection. Lieutenant Colonel Chappuis divided his 2-mile arc into company sectors. Easy Company, under 1st Lieutenant Norman Decay, held the northern positions along the road to Bourcy. Fox Company covered the eastern approach. Dog Company, severely under strength after losses in Holland, held a shortened sector to the west. Each company commander subdivided his sector into platoon positions, and each platoon leader positioned his squads to create overlapping fields of fire. The foxholes themselves followed airborne specifications developed through combat experience. They were deeper than regular infantry foxholes, 4 feet minimum, providing complete below-ground protection when men crouched. They were narrower, just wide enough for 2 men, forcing occupants to stay low. And they were always dug in pairs or groups of 3, close enough that men could communicate by voice, but far enough apart that a single artillery shell could not eliminate multiple positions. Machine gun positions received special attention. The Browning M 1919, a 4 heavy machine gun, water-cooled and belt-fed, could sustain fire for extended periods without overheating. Each gun weighed 31 pounds, not including the tripod mount, water can, and ammunition. In defensive positions, crews dug the guns in below ground level with overhead cover, leaving only the barrel exposed. They positioned the guns to create grazing fire, bullets travelling parallel to the ground at knee-to-waist height, sweeping across the killing zone. The effective range of the M1919 A4 was listed as 1,000 yards in training manuals, but in defensive fire at night against infantry assault, gunners were instructed to hold fire until targets reached 300 yards. At that range, the cone of fire from the gun's dispersion pattern was tight enough to guarantee hits, and the psychological impact of sustained machine gun fire at close range was devastating to attacking infantry. Ammunition distribution was critical. Each machine gun position received 2,000 rounds as a basic load, packed in 250-round cloth belts stored in metal cans. Additional ammunition was cached in protected positions behind the gun emplacements, where runners could retrieve it during lulls in fighting. BAR gunners received their 300 rounds in 20-round magazines, 15 magazines per man. Riflemen distributed Moni clips throughout their cartridge belts and pockets, ensuring that even if they lost their primary ammunition carrier, they would still have rounds available. The defensive plan emphasized fire discipline. Automatic weapons would not open fire until enemy infantry reached designated kill zones, usually marked by natural terrain features that commanders and gunners had studied during daylight. Riflemen would hold fire until even closer, 200 yards or less, to ensure that every shot had a high probability of hitting a target. The goal was not to stop the enemy at maximum range, but to draw them into the killing zone and destroy them there with concentrated fire. Communication between positions relied primarily on sound-powered field telephones, wire lines strung between foxholes during the defensive preparation. Radio communication existed at company and battalion level, but individual squads and platoons depended on telephone wire or runners. This system was vulnerable to artillery fire that could cut the wires, but it was more reliable than trying to coordinate defensive fire through shouted commands during combat. Medical support was minimal. Each squad had one man designated as an aid man, carrying morphine, sulfur powder, bandages, and tourniquets. Company aid stations were just slightly enlarged foxholes, where the company medic, usually a conscientious objector trained in combat medicine, could work on wounded men before evacuating them to battalion aid. There was no expectation of rapid medical evacuation. Wounded men would remain in the perimeter until the tactical situation allowed movement to rear areas. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical defensive preparation. Officers and NCOs moved among the positions during the late afternoon of December 20th, reminding men of lessons learned in previous fights. The Germans would likely attack at night or in early morning, using darkness to close with American positions. They would advance in company or battalion strength, supported by artillery fire and possibly armor. The key to defeating them was maintaining position, not panicking when Germans appeared close to the foxholes, trusting in the defensive plan, and firing controlled bursts rather than wasting ammunition. These veterans needed little convincing. They had seen this tactical situation before in Holland, where small groups of paratroopers held positions against larger German forces through superior firepower and defensive discipline. They knew that German infantry, trained primarily for offensive operations, often struggled when attacking prepared defensive positions. They knew that German units in December 1944 included many Volksgrenadier divisions, infantry formations with lower training standards and less combat experience than the Wehrmacht units they had faced earlier in the war. Most importantly, they knew their weapons and they trusted their training. When the Germans came, the paratroopers would be ready. The German assault began at 0200 hours on December 21st. The attack opened with artillery fire, 88mm guns firing from positions east of Foy. Shells burst in the tree canopy above the paratroopers' positions, sending fragments of wood and metal down into the foxholes. Men pressed themselves against the frozen earth, helmets pulled low, as the barrage walked across the defensive line. The artillery preparation lasted 15 minutes. Then silence. In their foxholes, paratroopers checked weapons, ensured they had clear fields of fire, and waited. They could hear movement in the darkness, the distinctive sound of many men moving through frozen undergrowth, commands in German carrying across the winter air. Outpost positions, one-man or two-man listening posts placed 50 to 100 yards forward of the main defensive line, reported German infantry forming up in the tree line 300 yards out. The reports came by telephone to company commanders, who relayed them to Lieutenant Colonel Chappuis in the battalion command post. The pattern was consistent across all sectors. German infantry, in company strength, moving forward in assault formation. At Easy Company's positions north of Foy, First Lieutenant Norman Dike passed the order down to his platoon leaders. Hold fire until the Germans reached the designated kill zone, marked by a stone wall 200 yards from the American foxholes. Machine gunners sighted along their portard, barrels, confirming their aim points. BAR men settled their weapons on the forward edges of their foxholes. Riflemen checked that their moan clips were seated properly and that their safeties were off. The German infantry advanced in classic assault formation, squad lines moving forward with intervals between men. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, reassigned to the West for the Ardennes offensive. They had been told that American paratroopers, while elite troops, were exhausted from continuous combat, low on ammunition, and demoralized by being surrounded. The German officers believed they were conducting a night assault against weakened defenders who would break under determined attack. They reached the stone wall. American machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Their muzzle flashes brilliant in the darkness, tracer rounds arcing red across the frozen ground. The sound was overwhelming, the sustained hammering of multiple heavy machine guns firing at maximum rate. Each gun put out 400 to 500 rounds per minute. 6 guns firing together meant over 2,000 rounds per minute sweeping across the killing zone. The effect on the advancing German infantry was catastrophic. Men fell in groups, cut down by the grazing fire that caught them at knee and waist height. Those who dove for cover behind the stone wall found themselves pinned, unable to advance or retreat without exposing themselves to the machine gun fire. German officers tried to organize their men for a rush across the final 200 yards, but the volume of fire made coordinated movement impossible. BAR gunners and riflemen added their fire to the machine guns. The defensive system was working exactly as designed. The Germans were fixed in the killing zone, taking casualties with every passing second, unable to close with the American positions. Return fire from German rifles and machine guns was ineffective, bullets passing overhead or striking the earthen parapets of the piters. American foxholes without causing casualties. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German assault lasted 40 minutes before the survivors withdrew, dragging wounded men back through the darkness toward their starting positions. Paratroopers in the forward foxholes could hear German voices, officers shouting orders, wounded men calling for medics. Then silence again, broken only by the occasional rifle shot as American sentries fired at movement in the darkness. The pattern repeated 3 more times through the night. German infantry would advance. American machine guns would open fire at the designated range. The Germans would take heavy casualties and withdraw. Each assault was smaller than the last, as German company commanders recognized that frontal attacks against prepared defensive positions, supported by heavy automatic weapons, were simply suicide. By 0600 hours. As dawn began to break over the Belgian countryside, the German attacks had stopped. Paratroopers could see the cost of the night's fighting scattered across the frozen ground in front of their positions. Bodies in field grey uniforms lay in groups where the machine gun fire had caught them. Wounded men who had been unable to crawl back to German lines during the night called out for help in German. Abandoned equipment, rifles, machine guns, ammunition pouches, littered the approaches to the American positions. Casualty counts conducted after dawn revealed the full extent of the German losses. American forward observers, using binoculars to scan the killing zones, counted over 200 German bodies visible from the American positions. Wounded men evacuated during brief ceasefires between attacks, later reported by German prisoners, added several hundred more to the casualty total. German prisoners captured during the final assault, men who had given up, rather than continue attacking, reported that their companies had suffered 50 to 70% casualties. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. German infantry units totaling approximately 2,000 men had attempted to overrun 200 American paratroopers in prepared defensive positions. The result was approximately 800 German casualties, killed or wounded, in 6 hours of combat. The American casualties were fewer than 20 men, mostly from the initial artillery barrage and from German return fire during the assaults. The disparity was not the result of German tactical incompetence. The German officers commanding the assault were experienced Eastern Front veterans who understood infantry tactics. Their men were not poorly trained Volksgrenadiers, but soldiers from regular Wehrmacht divisions. The assault plans were conventional and sound, using darkness to close with enemy positions, employing artillery preparation to suppress defenders, advancing in proper formation with fire support. What defeated them was the combination of American firepower and defensive preparation. The paratroopers had more automatic weapons per man than the Germans expected. They had positioned those weapons in mutually supporting positions that created overlapping fields of fire. They had ammunition reserves that allowed sustained fire throughout the night. They had fire discipline that prevented wasting ammunition on long-range shots with low probability of hitting targets. And they had defensive positions that protected them from return fire while allowing them to engage attacking forces at optimal range. German prisoners interrogated after the battle expressed shock at the volume of American automatic weapons fire. They had expected to face rifle fire from foxholes, which individual soldiers could suppress or avoid through proper use of cover and movement. They had not expected to face sustained machine gun fire from multiple positions that made movement across open ground nearly impossible. One German officer, a company commander whose unit had lost over half its strength in the first assault, told American interrogators that advancing against the American positions was like walking into a wall of bullets. The psychological impact on the attacking German forces was significant. By dawn on December 21st, German units that had begun the assault with confidence in their numerical superiority and tactical training were demoralized and combat ineffective. Officers could not convince their men to make additional attacks against positions that had already cost them so many casualties. The German regimental commander, realizing that frontal assaults were futile, ordered his forces to maintain pressure on the American perimeter through artillery fire and small probing attacks while waiting for the Americans to exhaust their ammunition and be forced to withdraw. That withdrawal never came. The paratroopers at Foy held their positions for 3 more days, through December 24th, when elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through German lines and reached Bastogne, relieving the encirclement. During those 3 days, German forces made no additional major assaults on the Foy perimeter. They had learned the cost of attacking prepared airborne defensive positions, and they chose to avoid repeating the experience. For the paratroopers who had defended Foy through that long December night, the battle confirmed everything they had been taught in training. Being surrounded was not a disaster, but a tactical condition that could be turned to advantage through proper defensive preparation and superior firepower. German infantry, despite their numerical superiority, could not overcome determined defenders in prepared positions with adequate ammunition. The automatic weapons they carried, particularly the heavy machine guns that formed the backbone of their defensive system, were decisive in stopping enemy assaults. The battle also confirmed the paratroopers' belief in their own superiority. They were elite troops not because of propaganda or self-congratulation, but because their training, equipment, and tactical doctrine gave them genuine advantages in combat situations like Foy. They had been told they were the best infantry in the American army. The casualty ratios from Foy, 40 German casualties for every American casualty, proved that claim was not empty boasting but observable fact supported by combat results. The battle at Foy on December 21, 1944, was not strategically decisive. It did not change the outcome of the Battle of the Bastogne or alter the course of the Ardennes offensive. The German attack would ultimately fail not because of what happened at Foy, but because American forces held the critical road junctions at Bastogne itself, because the weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to strike German supply columns, and because Patton's Third Army arrived to relieve the encircled defenders. But for the men who fought at Foy, and for American airborne doctrine more broadly, The battle represented validation of everything the paratroopers had been taught about defensive warfare. The tactical principles they had learned in training, the emphasis on automatic weapons and ammunition reserves, the psychological conditioning that made being surrounded seem like a tactical advantage rather than a crisis, all of these had been tested under the worst possible conditions and had proven effective. The casualty reports compiled in the days after December 21st told a story that would be studied in military staff colleges for decades. 2nd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment had suffered fewer than 20 casualties while inflicting approximately 800 on German forces attempting to overrun their positions. The kill ratio was 40-1. No other engagement in the Ardennes offensive, and few engagements in the entire European theatre, produced such lopsided results in favor of defending American forces. The survivors of the German assault units told a different story in their post-battle reports and prisoner interrogations. They described an experience that fundamentally challenged their understanding of infantry combat. German tactical doctrine emphasized aggression, movement, and concentrated force at the point of attack. Their training taught them that determined infantry assault, properly supported by artillery and conducted with courage, could overcome defensive positions through shock and violence of action. At Foy, they had followed that doctrine precisely. They had concentrated superior forces, used artillery preparation, advanced under cover of darkness to minimize defender advantages, and pressed their attacks with determination. And they had been destroyed, not defeated through gradual attrition over days of fighting, but destroyed in hours through firepower so intense that movement across open ground became impossible. German officers analyzing the battle in after-action reports focused on the density of American automatic weapons. They calculated that the American positions at Foy had approximately one machine gun for every 25 to 30 meters of defensive front, a concentration they had not encountered in previous engagements with American forces. They noted the ammunition discipline that allowed those machine guns to sustain fire throughout multiple assault waves without exhausting their basic loads. They remarked on the quality of the defensive positions, dug below ground level with overhead cover, that protected American crews from return fire. What they did not fully understand, because they had not experienced American airborne training, was that this concentration of firepower and defensive preparation was standard for all American parachute infantry units. Foy was not an exceptional case, where unusually well-equipped defenders happened to stop a German attack. It was a demonstration of what American airborne forces could accomplish when implementing their standard tactical doctrine under typical combat conditions. The broader implications became clear as the war in Europe continued into 1945. German forces that had fought American paratroopers at Foy, or who received reports from units that had, showed marked reluctance to engage airborne forces in subsequent battles. Intelligence officers noted that German units would maneuver to avoid contact with identified American airborne positions, preferring to attack sectors held by regular infantry divisions, even when those sectors were more heavily defended. This tactical caution represented a psychological victory as significant as any battlefield success. The Germans had learned that attacking American paratroopers was expensive, that the cost in casualties was disproportionate to the tactical gains achieved, and that numerical superiority meant little against defenders who could generate such overwhelming firepower. The reputation American airborne forces had built through training and propaganda, the image of elite troops who could fight surrounded and outnumbered, had been validated through combat results that German commanders could not ignore or rationalize away. For the American military establishment, the battles around Bastogne, and Foy specifically, confirmed decisions made years earlier about the structure and equipment of airborne forces. The investment in specialized training, the extra pay for jump-qualified soldiers, the allocation of additional automatic weapons to airborne units. All of these costs had been justified by combat performance. Paratroopers were expensive to train and equip, but they delivered results that conventional infantry could not match in situations requiring defense against numerically superior forces. The weapons systems that had proven decisive at Foy received renewed attention from Army Ordnance departments. The Browning M1919, A 4 heavy machine gun, introduced in 1937 and considered somewhat obsolete by 1944 standards, had demonstrated its continuing value in defensive operations. Its water-cooled barrel allowed sustained fire that air-cooled machine guns could not maintain. Its belt-fed ammunition system eliminated the magazine changes that limited fire from other automatic weapons. Its weight, often criticized as excessive for a portable weapon, became an advantage in static defensive positions where stability mattered more than mobility. Production priorities shifted accordingly. Factories that had been transitioning to newer, lighter machine gun designs received orders to maintain M1919A4 production. Ammunition allocations to airborne units increased, ensuring that future defensive operations would not fail due to insufficient basic loads. Training curricula at Fort Benning and other airborne schools incorporated lessons from Foy, emphasizing defensive fire techniques and ammunition discipline. The psychological impact on American airborne forces themselves was equally significant. The men who had fought at Foy returned to their units after the Ardennes offensive with enhanced confidence in their training and equipment. They had faced the worst tactical situation possible for infantry, surrounded and outnumbered by a determined enemy, and they had won decisively. The experience validated their belief that airborne training created genuinely superior soldiers, not through propaganda, but through measurable combat effectiveness. This confidence carried forward to subsequent operations. When the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped across the Rhine in Operation Varsity in March 1945, paratroopers landing behind German lines knew from combat experience that being surrounded was a condition they could manage. When isolated groups found themselves cut off from their units during the confused hours after the drop, they established perimeter defenses and fought effectively until link-up occurred, applying lessons learned at places like Foy. The German military drew different conclusions from the same events. After-action analyses conducted by Wehrmacht staff officers in early 1945 identified American airborne forces as high-priority threats, requiring special tactical approaches. German units receiving orders to attack positions held by American paratroopers were instructed to conduct extensive reconnaissance, employ heavy artillery preparation far beyond normal doctrine, and expect high casualties even in successful attacks. These tactical adjustments represented acknowledgement that American airborne forces had achieved a qualitative superiority that numerical advantages could not overcome. German infantry might outnumber American paratroopers 5-1 or 10-1, but those numerical ratios did not translate into combat advantage when the Americans held prepared positions with adequate ammunition. The mathematics of defensive firepower, the concentration of automatic weapons, and the ammunition to sustain them created a tactical reality that no amount of courage or aggressive tactics could overcome. The recognition spread through German military channels during the final months of the war. Units ordered to assault American airborne positions requested additional artillery support, armor support, or orders to bypass the positions entirely. Officers who had commanded assaults against American paratroopers and survived shared their experiences informally, warning other commanders about the intensity of fire they would face. The institutional knowledge that attacking American airborne positions was futile became embedded in German tactical thinking at the regimental and divisional level. This demoralization effect, the degradation of enemy willingness to engage specific American units, was as valuable strategically as any battlefield victory. It meant that American airborne forces tied down German troops disproportionate to their actual numbers, because German commanders had to allocate extra resources to sectors where paratroopers were present. It meant that German tactical planning became more cautious and defensive when American airborne units were identified in an area. It meant that the psychological impact of elite American forces extended beyond the immediate battlefield to influence German operational planning at higher command levels. The story of 200 paratroopers letting themselves be surrounded by 2,000 Germans, then inflicting 800 casualties in 6 hours, reveals something fundamental about military effectiveness that transcends the specific tactical details of the Battle of Foy. It demonstrates that in modern warfare, Technological and doctrinal advantages can overcome numerical disadvantages, to a degree that would have seemed impossible in previous eras of combat. The German forces attacking Foy were not poorly trained militia or second-rate occupation troops. They were experienced soldiers from regular Wehrmacht divisions, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had faced and defeated Soviet forces in similar numerical ratios. Their officers understood infantry tactics. Their assault plans followed sound military doctrine. They advanced with determination and courage. By every conventional measure, they should have overwhelmed the American positions through sheer numbers and sustained pressure. What defeated them was not superior American courage or fighting spirit. The Germans were fighting for their homeland in December 1944, defending German territory against invasion, arguably the strongest possible motivation for soldiers. What defeated them was the combination of American firepower, defensive preparation, and tactical doctrine that allowed 200 men to generate more effective combat power than 2,000 attackers could overcome. The M1919, a 4-machine gun, firing 400 to 500 rounds per minute, created a volume of fire that made movement across open ground suicidal. The ammunition reserves that allowed those guns to sustain fire throughout the night ensured that German assaults could not succeed through persistence. The defensive positions that protected American crews from return fire meant that German infantry could not suppress the machine guns through rifle fire. And the fire discipline that prevented American forces from wasting ammunition on low-probability shots ensured that the defensive system remained effective through multiple assault waves. These advantages were not accidental or improvised. They were the product of deliberate decisions made years earlier about how to structure, train, and equip American airborne forces. Someone in the Army staff system in 1940 or 1941 had calculated that paratroopers would often fight, surrounded and outnumbered, and had decided that the solution was to give them enough automatic weapons and ammunition to create defensive firepower that numerical disadvantages could not overcome. Someone had designed training that conditioned men psychologically to view being surrounded as a tactical opportunity rather than a crisis. Someone had created the doctrine that paratroopers implemented at Foy with such devastating effectiveness. The results validated those decisions in the most absolute terms possible. Combat performance measured in casualty ratios that proved American tactical doctrine was superior to German tactical doctrine, at least in defensive operations involving elite infantry forces. The Germans learned this lesson painfully, through the bodies of 800 soldiers killed or wounded in futile assaults against American positions. The Americans learned it triumphantly, through survival and victory, in a tactical situation that should have resulted in their destruction. For Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chappuis, standing in his command post on the morning of December 21st, and counting the German dead scattered across the frozen ground in front of his defensive positions, the lesson was clear. His decision to let his battalion be surrounded, to dig in and fight from prepared positions, rather than attempting withdrawal to Bastogne, had been correct. The training his men had received, the weapons they carried, the ammunition reserves they had maintained, all of these had proven adequate to accomplish what conventional military wisdom said was impossible. The paratroopers who had fought through that December night learned something equally important. They learned that the confidence instilled through months of brutal training was not empty propaganda, but an accurate assessment of their capabilities. They were elite troops, not because someone had told them they were elite, but because they could accomplish missions that other infantry units could not accomplish. Being surrounded was not a disaster. It was a tactical condition they were specifically designed to exploit, and when they implemented their training properly, they could destroy enemy forces that outnumbered them 10-1. This knowledge, earned through combat at Foy and similar engagements across the European theatre, became part of American airborne culture. It informed the training of subsequent generations of paratroopers, from the immediate post-war period through Korea, Vietnam, and into the modern era. The tactical lessons, the emphasis on automatic weapons and defensive fire, the psychological conditioning that made soldiers welcome difficult tactical situations, These elements remained central to airborne training because they had been proven effective under the worst possible combat conditions. The 200 paratroopers at Foy had allowed themselves to be surrounded because they knew something their German opponents did not understand until it was too late. They knew that in modern warfare, with proper training and equipment, a small force of elite infantry in defensive positions could generate more combat power than a much larger attacking force could overcome. They had proven it at Normandy, proven it in Holland, and they proved it again on a frozen Belgian hillside in December 1944. The cost was 800 German casualties in 6 hours. The lesson was eternal. In warfare, quality can overcome quantity, but only when that quality is built on genuine tactical superiority verified through combat results, not merely claimed through propaganda and institutional pride. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.